They found the chalkboard 3 days after the funeral, face down in the mud behind what was left of the schoolhouse. Caleb Dunn, 28 years old, stood in the rain holding the cracked slate, while his boy's last drawing stared up at him. A house with smoke coming out the chimney. 2 stick figures in the yard, one tall, one small. The small one had a circle around its head that might have been a hat or might have been a halo. Thomas had drawn it the morning before the diphtheria took him, and now the chalk was running in the rain, the lines bleeding into nothing, and Caleb pressed the board against his chest and stood there until his shirt was soaked through and the cold had gone deep enough to reach bone. That was October of 1883 in a town called Harker's Bend, Wyoming Territory, where the Sweetwater River cut through a valley so narrow the wind funneled through it like breath through a flute. Caleb had been the school teacher. Had been. The schoolhouse roof collapsed under an early snow 2 weeks before Thomas died, and then Margaret went the day after, and by the time Caleb crawled out of the fog of grief long enough to look around, the town council had already voted to consolidate the school with the one in Rawlins, 18 miles east. You can keep the lot, Emmett Ferris told him, standing on the porch of the general store with his thumbs in his vest pockets. Emmett was the council chairman, a man who kept his beard trimmed to a point like it was a weapon. But nobody's paying to rebuild a schoolhouse for 11 children when Rawlins has a perfectly good one. He said it with the careful patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a slow student, and Caleb understood then that he was no longer the teacher. He was the lesson, the cautionary tale the town would tell about what happens when a man puts too much stock in books and chalk and not enough in something practical. "She'll freeze him out by Christmas," one of the women said to another outside the dry goods store, meaning not the weather, but Martha Pruitt, the widow who ran the boarding house, where Caleb had taken a room after his own house felt like a coffin with windows. Martha had been kind for the first month, set extra biscuits on his plate, didn't charge for the boys' room after Thomas was gone. But kindness in a frontier town ran on the same fuel as everything else, and by November, Martha was leaving the bill on his door every Monday, the numbers underlined twice. Caleb had $41, a dead wife's sewing kit, a cracked chalkboard, and a piece of land with a collapsed building on it that nobody wanted. The schoolhouse lot sat at the edge of town, where the ground sloped down toward the river, and behind it, the bluffs rose up in layers of red and gray stone, like the pages of a book left open to the weather. He walked out there on a Tuesday morning, when the frost was thick enough to crunch under his boots and the air tasted like iron. The schoolhouse timbers lay scattered like bones. The potbelly stove sat cocked sideways in the wreckage, one leg broken, its chimney pipe bent at an angle that looked almost human, like a man trying to stand after being knocked down. He should have left. Rawlins was hiring at the railroad office. He could clerk. He could do figures. He was good with figures. But something held him to that wrecked lot, the way a nail holds a board, not because it wants to, but because it was driven in too deep to pull out clean. He found the cave on the 3rd day of clearing timber. It was not dramatic. There was no hidden door, no mysterious passage. The collapsed north wall of the schoolhouse had been built against the bluff face, and when Caleb pulled away the broken boards, he found that the rock behind them was not solid. There was a gap shoulder width where the limestone had fractured and worn away into a natural cavity. He could feel warm air breathing out of it, steady and damp like the earth exhaling. He lit a candle stub and squeezed through. The space inside was larger than he expected. Not a room exactly, but a chamber roughly 15 feet deep and 10 across with a ceiling that arched up to maybe 8 feet at its highest point. The floor was dry limestone, smooth in places where water had once moved across it. Along the back wall, a thin seam of water seeped down the rock face, and when Caleb touched it, his fingers came away warm. Not hot. Warm, the kind of warmth that comes from deep earth, where the temperature holds steady, year-round 55 degrees, regardless of whether the surface is baking in July or buried under January snow. He stood there for a long time, feeling the air, studying the walls by candlelight. The limestone was solid. No cracks spreading, no loose sections threatening to come down. The warm seep meant there was geothermal activity somewhere below the same forces that fed the hot springs up in Yellowstone country 150 miles north. It was not enough to heat a house, but it was enough to keep a cave above freezing when the outside air dropped to 30 below. His hands were shaking, and it was not from cold. Caleb knew things. That was his curse, and his only remaining currency. He knew that the Shoshone had used natural caves in this region for winter shelter long before any white man drew a property line. He knew that limestone was a natural insulator, that 6 feet of rock held heat better than any timber wall. He knew that the pioneers who had survived the worst winters on the plains were not the ones with the biggest houses, but the ones who understood that the earth itself was a blanket if you knew how to pull it over you. He also knew that no one in Harker's Bend would believe a schoolteacher could build anything worth standing in. He started with the gap in the bluff, widened it with a pickaxe, borrowed from the livery stable, whose owner, a quiet Cornish immigrant named Pascoe, charged him nothing and asked no questions. Caleb worked the opening until it was wide enough to walk through without turning sideways, then framed it with salvaged schoolhouse timbers, creating a doorway that transitioned from the outside world into the rock. He hung the broken door from the schoolhouse on new iron hinges, and when he closed it behind him for the first time, the silence was so complete he could hear his own blood moving. Inside, he built a sleeping platform against the east wall, raised 18 inches off the limestone floor on legs cut from the old schoolhouse beams. A frontier trick Margaret had read about in one of her homesteading journals. Cold air sinks. 18 inches of elevation meant the difference between shivering all night and sleeping warm. He stuffed a mattress tick with dried sweet grass from the riverbank, which served double duty as insulation, and Margaret would have noted a natural deterrent for lice. The warm seep along the back wall he channeled into a shallow trough carved into the floor, letting it pool into a basin roughly 2 feet across before draining through a natural crack. It gave him a constant supply of clean water at 58 degrees. He could wash in it. He could drink it. In the deepest cold, the steam rising from it would add a few degrees of humidity to the cave air, and humid air holds heat better than dry. He hauled the potbelly stove in piece by piece, repaired the broken leg with a length of railroad iron. Pascoe let him have, and ran the chimney pipe up through a natural fissure in the ceiling that drew like it had been designed for the purpose. The first fire he lit drew clean and steady, and within 20 minutes the cave was warm enough that he stripped to his shirt sleeves and sat on the sleeping platform with his hands on his knees, breathing air that smelled like warm stone and wood smoke and sweet grass, and he wept. He had not wept for Thomas. He had not wept for Margaret. The grief had been too large for tears, the way a river too wide for its banks does not overflow, but simply rises silent, drowning everything at its own pace. But the warmth broke something in him, or fixed something. He could not tell which. Emmett Ferris found out in December, walked out to the lot with 2 council members to discuss selling the land, and found Caleb hauling a sack of river clay up the slope. "You're living in a hole," Emmett said. He said it flat, the way a man states a fact he finds beneath discussion. "I'm living in the bluff," Caleb said. "It's a hole, Caleb." Emmett looked at the other two men. "The schoolteacher is living in a hole in the ground, like a badger." He did not laugh, which was worse than laughing. His expression was the one he wore when calculating sums that came out unfavorable. There was no cruelty in it. Just a man drawing a line in a ledger. But here was the thing about Emmett Ferris that Caleb noticed, and no one else seemed to. Emmett's hands were shaking too. Not from cold. Emmett had a tremor that had started that autumn, a fine vibration in his fingers that he hid by keeping them in his pockets or wrapped around a coffee cup. Caleb had seen it during the last council meeting, the pen jumping in Emmett's grip, the signature on the school closure document wavering like a lie detector needle. Something was wrong with Emmett Ferris, and Emmett knew it, and the knowing sat behind his eyes like a second man, looking out through the same windows. Caleb could have said something. He chose not to. That was not mercy and not strategy. It was simply recognition. One man's hidden fracture acknowledging another's. Through December he insulated, packed river clay mixed with dried grass into every gap between the timber framing and the rock, building up a wall 6 inches thick that would cure hard as adobe. Along the ceiling where heat collected, he mounted a shelf of flat stones to absorb warmth during the day and radiate it back through the night, the same thermal mass principle the Pueblo people had used for centuries. He preserved food the way Margaret's grandmother had taught her, and Margaret had taught him. Root vegetables buried in sand boxes in the deepest part of the cave where the temperature never varied. Smoked venison hung from ceiling hooks where the warm air kept it dry. Sauerkraut packed in a stone crock because fermented cabbage does not freeze, and a man who eats it through the winter does not get scurvy, a fact the Germans and the Scandinavians knew, and the Americans refused to learn because the smell offended them. The schoolhouse chalkboard he mounted on the cave wall near the sleeping platform. He did not clean it. Thomas's drawing stayed, the chalk lines faded, but still there. The house with smoke, the two figures, the circle that might have been a hat. He talked to it sometimes. Not to Thomas, to the drawing itself, telling it what he was building as if the assignment had been given by a child's hand and he was turning in his work. The blizzard of '84 came on the second week of January. It did not announce itself the way storms usually did, with a gradual graying of the sky and a shift in the wind. It came like a wall. 1 hour the sky was pale blue, and the temperature was 12 degrees manageable ordinary. The next hour, the world turned white, and the temperature dropped to 9 below and kept dropping. The wind came from the northwest at 50 miles an hour, driving snow so dense that a man could not see his own hand at arm's length. It was the kind of storm that killed cattle standing up. They would find them in the spring, frozen in place, still on their feet, coated in ice, like statues of themselves. Harker's Bend had 26 buildings. By the end of the first night, 3 roofs had collapsed under the snow load. By the end of the second day, the temperature hit 31 below zero, and the wood supplies ran short because no one could reach their wood piles without risking disorientation and death. Emmett Ferris's house, the finest in town, 2 stories with glass windows imported from Denver, lost its north-facing wall to the wind. The glass blew in first, and then the cold entered like something alive, and the Ferris family, Emmett and his wife, Dorothy, and their 3 children retreated to the kitchen and piled furniture against the doorway and burned chair legs in the cook stove. In the cave behind the collapsed schoolhouse, Caleb Dunn sat on his sleeping platform in his shirt sleeves, drinking warm water from his geothermal spring, reading by the light of the potbelly stove. The temperature inside was 47 degrees. Not comfortable by parlor standards, but livable. Deeply, fundamentally livable. The limestone walls absorbed the wind's fury and gave back nothing. The 6 feet of rock between him and the storm might as well have been 60. He could hear the blizzard, a distant roaring like a train passing through a tunnel far above, but it was an abstraction. A story someone was telling in another room. He ate smoked venison and sauerkraut and a baked potato he cooked on the stovetop. He slept 8 hours and woke to silence so deep it frightened him before he remembered that silence in a blizzard only meant the rock was doing its work. On the 3rd day, he dug out. The snow was chest deep at the cave mouth, and the air was still brutal, but the wind had dropped. Caleb wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned, tied a rope to the door frame, and waded toward town with the rope paying out behind him. He found the widow Suttner first, Anna Suttner, 63, who had mocked Caleb's cave dwelling to anyone who would listen, who had told Martha Pruitt that a man living underground was 1 step from living in a grave. Anna was in her house, wrapped in quilts, her cook stove cold, her firewood gone, her fingers blue-white at the tips. Frostbite. Another hour and it would have been her feet, and then it would have been over. Caleb carried her on his back, through the snow to the cave. She weighed almost nothing. She did not speak. He went back for the Ferris family. Emmett was sitting in his ruined kitchen with his arms around his youngest, a girl of 4, and his hands were shaking so badly he could not grip the child. Dorothy was conscious, but barely her lips cracked her eyes, unfocused. The 3 children were silent in the way that children become silent when fear has gone past, crying and into something older. Caleb Emmett said. His voice was stripped of everything. No authority. No calculation. Just a man saying another man's name the way you'd say the name of a rope thrown to you in deep water. Can you walk? Caleb said. I don't know. Try. They made the trip in 2 groups. Caleb carried the youngest Ferris girl and held the middle boy's hand and led them to the cave, then went back for Emmett and Dorothy, and the oldest, a boy of 12, who was the only one still steady on his feet. By nightfall, there were 14 people in the cave. Caleb's sleeping platform held Anna Suttner and the 3 Ferris children. The adults sat along the walls, knees drawn up, packed close enough to share warmth. The potbelly stove burned steady. The geothermal seep steamed gently in the corner. Caleb passed around smoked venison and sauerkraut and showed them how to drink from the warm spring, cupping their hands under the trough, and the water was the thing that broke them. Not the rescue, not the shelter. The water. Because it was warm and clean and it came from the earth without being asked, and when you have been freezing for 3 days, warm water is not a drink. It is a sermon. Emmett Ferris sat against the west wall with his daughter, asleep in his lap. His hands were still shaking. In the stove light, Caleb could see the tremor clearly, and Emmett could see Caleb seeing it, and neither of them looked away. How long have you known Emmett? Said quietly. Since September. Emmett nodded. He looked at his hands, the way a man looks at a tool that has begun to fail. What is this place? He said, but it was not really a question about the cave. Caleb sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. It's a schoolhouse, he said. A different kind. Emmett was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Someone's child murmured in sleep. I closed your school, Emmett said. I know. I thought it was the practical decision. It was. Caleb paused. It was also wrong. Emmett looked at him. The tremor made his jaw clench and unclench involuntarily, a small motion that, in a different context, might have looked like a man chewing over a difficult thought. "I am going to need help," he said, and he was not talking about the blizzard. Caleb did not answer right away. He listened to the storm, that distant roaring filtered through 6 feet of limestone until it was just a hum, a vibration you felt in your back teeth. He listened to 14 people breathing in a cave that a month ago everyone in town had called a badger hole. He looked at the chalkboard mounted on the far wall, half hidden behind Anna Sutner's quilted shoulder, and he could just make out the edge of Thomas's drawing. The house, with smoke. The tall figure and the small one. "We'll figure it out," Caleb said. The blizzard lasted 2 more days. 19 people sheltered in the cave before it was over. Caleb organized them with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent years managing a classroom of children who did not want to sit still, which is to say he gave everyone a job and made the jobs feel important. The Ferris boy fed the stove. Anna Sutner, whose fingers were recovering, sorted the remaining food stores. Dorothy Ferris sang to the children at night, hymns mostly her voice, thin and reedy in the stone chamber, but somehow exactly right the way a single candle is exactly right in a dark room. When the storm broke and the sky cleared to a blue so sharp it hurt to look at the people of Harker's Bend walked out of the cave blinking like animals born underground. The town was buried. Drifts reached the roof lines. The general store's front porch had been ripped clean off and deposited 40 yards south, leaning against the livery stable like a drunk against a lamppost. They rebuilt. Of course they rebuilt. That is what people in that country did, because the alternative was to lie down and become part of the landscape, and they were not ready for that. But something had shifted. A weight had moved from one side of a scale to the other, and nothing sat quite level anymore. Caleb rebuilt the schoolhouse, not the old one, a new one using the cave as its foundation and back wall extending outward with river stone hauled up from the Sweetwater, each one selected for fit and mortared with the same clay and grass mixture he had used to seal his shelter. Pascoe helped, then the Ferris boy, then others arriving without announcement, picking up tools, working until their hands bled and their backs seized, and leaving without expecting thanks. Emmett Ferris donated the lumber. He signed the purchase order with a hand that shook so badly the ink scattered across the page in tiny droplets, and he did not hide it, and no one pretended not to see. The new schoolhouse opened in April of 1884. It was half above ground and half below a hybrid that the territorial newspaper called eccentric, and that the children called the Badger School, because children are honest, and names stick. The cave chamber became the winter classroom, naturally heated, warm enough that the children shed their coats by mid-morning. The above-ground room served spring and fall, its river stone walls, holding the cool of the earth in summer and the warmth of the stove in winter. Caleb taught there for the next 22 years. He mounted the old chalkboard on the wall of the cave classroom at the front, where a teacher's desk would go. He never cleaned it. The chalk lines faded year by year, the house and the figures and the circle softening into ghosts of themselves. But they were always there. Every child who passed through the Badger School saw them. Most asked what they were. Caleb would look at the board for a moment, the way a man looks at a window he has looked through 10,000 times, and still find something worth seeing. Homework, he would say. And then he would pick up a fresh piece of chalk and begin the lesson. On the last day, Caleb taught June of 1906. He was 51 years old, and his hair was white and his hands were steady. He walked out of the Badger School into a warm afternoon, carrying nothing, and he stopped at the edge of the lot where the old schoolhouse had collapsed 23 years before. A meadowlark was singing from the top of the bluff, that long liquid trill that sounds like a question asked so beautifully, you forget it needs an answer. The riverstone walls behind him held the sun. Inside, somewhere in the cool dark of the cave, the chalkboard waited, the drawing almost gone now, just the faintest trace of a small figure with a circle around its head, visible only if you knew where to look, and stood at exactly the right angle, in exactly the right light. Caleb listened to the meadowlark until it finished. Then he walked home,